We have really cool data for this benchmark. It was actually pretty exciting to work with. By bridging our pre-launch beta benchmarks with identical testing methods for the launch version of Destiny 2, including some driver changes, we're able to plot historical performance between AMD and NVIDIA hardware, and also able to better pinpoint CPU uplift, game code uplift, and GPU driver uplift. Matching today's data against our beta optimization guides, we're also able to see what graphic settings have caused the biggest gains in performance, all the way down to vendor-specific graphics setting optimizations. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by the Thermaltake Flow RGB closed-loop liquid cooler, which is a 360mm radiator plus 3 120 fans that are RGB illuminated, the Thermaltake Rain fans at that. This uses a 4.5 Gen Azetec pump, which is one of the faster pumps. You can learn more at the link in the description below. There's a lot more analysis in this game GPU benchmark than normally because we have so much more data to work with, having the beta of Destiny 2 as a baseline to work from, and it gives us a way to plot scalability of beta versus launch performance in Destiny 2, which includes Destiny 2 game changes and of course the driver changes for game-ready drivers. So that'll be interesting to look at and give us a better understanding of why some of the performance uplift happens the way it does, because if you just look at them one after the other, it can be a little confusing, where AMD will lead in some settings for some benchmarks, and NVIDIA will lead in other benchmarks with different settings. So this allows us to pinpoint that. And just to quickly recap the previous tests, we did a lot of stuff with Destiny 2. We had a texture comparison guide, which is still relevant now with launch. We had a game optimization mini guide at the bottom of the GPU benchmark that plotted the performance uplift from different settings and basically showed that depth of field was nuking performance on everything, especially AMD. And then we also had some information on CPU performance. So we had a CPU benchmark, which we have just redone for the launch version as well. So you'll find that on this channel soon. As for testing, the difference now largely is in anti-aliasing. So we always tested with FXAA for the most part, which made it really easy to work with. And that's because MSAA is now gone. Basically, Bungie said that MSAA was buggy in the beta, and with the launch version, they said, forget it, we're just going to remove it from the game, that'll fix the problems. So that's gone. We're still using FXAA here, which we used just originally because that was kind of a suspect move from Bungie. And other than that, we'll just go through the charts and you can get all the data there. As always, check the link in the description below for all the testing information if you're curious about the test platform used here. And also one other note, although averages are comparable between the beta and the launch tests, you can't directly compare the low numbers that we're using because we used a different tool for benchmarking. Because Destiny is kind of a moving target, it just blocks a lot of performance analysis tools and measurement tools. So we had to change once again, which means that the low numbers are not fully comparable. Starting with 1080p highest, as that's going to be the most popular configuration for the game, this configuration has us bumping into the frame rate wall for the 1080 Ti, which encounters the 200 FPS cap during some parts of the benchmark. Despite encountering an artificial cap, the 1080 Ti leads the 1080 by approximately 20%, though we'll look toward 1440p to better understand performance with an uncapped ceiling. The GTX 1080 operates a 156 FPS average, leading the Vega 64 card by 7.2% and marking substantial uplift from Vega's previous 122 FPS average in the beta version and with the previous AMD driver revision. That's roughly a 19% performance increase from beta to full launch for Vega 64, bringing 64 past the 1070 and now closer to the 1080. Vega 56 runs roughly tied with the 1070 SC in all walks of performance, including frame time performance, with the 1066GB and RX 588GB cards also near one another in the 3 reported metrics that we have here. Here's a frame time plot of the Vega 56 and GTX 1070 cards with these settings, just to give a better understanding of performance. As always, we're looking for consistency here, and note, of course, that lower is better, but more consistent is even better than just being a lower frame time. This next chart is pretty cool though. This is the scalability versus beta, and the line plot shows average FPS of each GPU versus the beta average FPS, which was tested with earlier driver and game versions. NVIDIA primarily benefits in the 1080 Ti, with the 1060, 1070, and 1080 posting smaller gains in the range of 3 to 6%. As you'll learn in a moment, these gains are primarily due to a CPU bottleneck loosening and not necessarily game changes. AMD's Vega 64 and Vega 56 clearly benefited from either the graphics options changes, the AMD drivers, or both, registering 12 to 19% performance uplift with these settings. The Polaris 580 also gains reasonably, and the difference is enough to swing Vega 56 tied with the 1070 as opposed to the previous deficit against the 1070. At 1440p highest is where the numbers start to come together. We plotted a similar performance stack, but note that this will switch up once we get to the high results. The 1080 Ti manages 111 FPS average, posting a 33% lead over the 1080 FTW, with Vega 64 leading the 1080 by 15%. This is a little different from the previous results, and Vega 56 is also functionally tied with the performance of the 1080 FTW at 1440p highest, plotting an 83 FPS average and keeping lows consistent. This places Vega 56 in a seriously advantaged position versus the 1080 and 1070, and if you can find it for MSRP, it makes it a better price competitor for these particular settings. But it gets more complex than that, as you'll see in a moment, because this largely hinges on what settings are used. Vega 56 does not always have this position, but it does in this test. As for scalability versus the beta, here's what we have. The NVIDIA cards show almost no scaling here, even less than the previous one, partly because NVIDIA already had game-ready drivers at the time of beta launch. So there's really not much ground for GTX devices to gain. NVIDIA already put that work in earlier, whereas AMD just now put out their most ready drivers for the game. Vega 56 posts a gain of 50.9% in average FPS 4-hour test, close to AMD's boasted 42% gains with the driver launch notes. Vega 64 posts 49.5% scaling. Although these aren't unprecedented gains from a driver update and game update, the two compounded together make for a large leap in the line plot. Here's where the data gets interesting. If you remember the 1080p scalability chart, the NVIDIA cards there were posting more noticeable gains than in the 1440p scalability chart, where we saw nearly zero gains in some of the tests. If we bring the 1080p plot back on the screen, you'll see that the 1080 Ti, as noted a moment ago, had the largest gains of all the NVIDIA cards, with the GTX 1060 posting nearly zero uplift. That's because of a CPU uplift in performance with Destiny 2, which we also have plotted in our forthcoming Destiny 2 CPU benchmark. The CPU uplift has alleviated some of the bottlenecking on the 1080 Ti, hence the bigger gains, but obviously hasn't helped at the 1060 level, because we were already limited by the GPU. This is an instance where at 1080p highest, the gains look like they do on the GPUs, not because of GPU uplift, but because of alleviated constraints in the CPU pipe. That's why the two plots are so different from one another. And then of course AMD's gains are largely because of that driver update, where the earlier version of the driver just wasn't built for Destiny properly. Reducing settings to high but staying at 1440p, we see the GTX 1070 catch back up to the RX Vega 56, leading marginally, with the 1080 leading Vega 64 card by 14%. The 1066GB and RX 588GB cards are within a few FPS of one another, with the 1066GB leading by 2.7%. And here's that beta versus launch scalability chart. It now becomes clear that AMD had the most to gain when running highest settings between launch and beta, which is something that we highlighted in our original Destiny 2 beta research and coverage. Again, the biggest gains were specifically for AMD running highest settings, with less concern regarding high. During the beta, we root caused this to depth of field on highest, which tanked AMD GPU performance specifically, but was also a big hit to NVIDIA. You can see that in our beta graphics optimization guide from the original launch of the beta version of the game. Changing only depth of field from highest to high could get us 82% of the way to switching all options to high. This means that you could leave everything on highest from the highest preset and change only depth of field and get 82% of the performance of just dropping all of them to high. That means that something in AMD's drivers or Destiny's code has resolved this problem for AMD hardware specifically, and that's the explanation for the performance we're seeing. Our final few tests are at 4K, with the highest plotting the 1080 Ti about 1 to 2 FPS ahead of the beta at 56.8 FPS average, and that leads the 1080 by 36% and the Vega 64 by 12%. Vega 64 outmatches the 1080 in this instance once again, and that's basically coming down to the settings. In terms of scaling, Vega 64 benefits the most, moving from 32 FPS to 50.6 FPS average with the launch drivers, and launch version of the game. Pretty momentous changes for AMD's Vega cards. At 4K high, as the previous tests have informed us, this changes again. Vega 64 is now behind the 1080, with the 1080 leading by 13%. The 1070 is now nearly tied with Vega 56, with Vega 56 slightly ahead. This was all conducted in what is functionally a single-player part of the game, or at least a co-op version. It's the campaign, more or less, not PvP. But we did do some multiplayer versus single-player testing in the beta, and found that, for the most part, they were fairly comparable in terms of performance, particularly in terms of performance scaling, which is the part you should care more about than just the raw FPS number. What you're looking at in these benchmarks is what kind of scaling do I see from one GPU to the next, not necessarily what hard FPS do I see from one to the next, because obviously that's going to change depending on where you benchmark in the game, and this game has a pretty wide range of frame rate depending on where you're testing. For the most part, it is fairly consistent. When testing, for example, the first 5 minutes of the game in the beta and now with the 1080 Ti, we saw at 4K highest settings in the range of 58 FPS average both times beta and launch version of the game, and that was consistent throughout that whole period. However, every now and then, it's not too often, but every now and then, there's a scene that is either exceptionally high in performance or sort of low in performance, not too much of the exceptional low end, and that means that depending on where you're testing, obviously it'll change a bit, but the scaling seems to be pretty much linear between all the devices, so that's what you want to look for the most. For multiplayer and single player testing, by which I mean PvP competitive versus the rest of the game, we did see generally comparable performance, and you can check the previous beta benchmark for that, but we're probably not going to redo all of those again, because the scaling is pretty much the way it was before, with the driver and game changes counted as well. So it's pretty much the same performance between different areas of the game. The scaling you see is from the updates though, and that applies everywhere, globally to the game. So there's some CPU uplift here as we plotted at 1080p highest. AMD depth of field had major GPU uplift. What we're not sure of is if the other options in the game between highest and high are impacting one GPU vendor versus the other more heavily, but depth of field definitely has had a pretty big change since the beta, because you can plot that trend, and that's why AMD is getting a lot of the uplift they're getting in some of the benchmarks, particularly the ones with highest settings, because depth of field has that difference. NVIDIA had minor uplift, and it's more likely attributable to game code changes, maybe some minor driver tweaks, although that seems there's not a lot of that if there are any, because the original drivers were pretty much at roughly 100% of the performance of where this is today, the exception being 1080p, where we were becoming CPU constrained, and that has now uplifted a bit with the launch version of the game. So that's all for this one. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to support this type of testing. If you like it, subscribe for more. We'll have a CPU benchmark as well. And check out store.gamersnexus.net for a shirt like this one. I'll see you all next time.